That morning, no one expected a single act of defiance to change military history. What began as routine training became a moment every soldier on base would remember, and one that would test the difference between following orders and doing what's right. The cold Hereford rain fell in a steady drizzle, turning the gravel paths of Stirling lines into a slick mosaic of mud and stone. It was just after dawn, the kind of grey light that seeped through the barracks windows without warmth, casting long shadows across the parade square. Credenhill Base stirred with the familiar rhythm of a British Army morning, the distant clang of mess tins, the low murmur of voices in the cookhouse, and the sharp bark of a sergeant major calling the muster. Here, at the heart of Hereford's military enclave, the Special Air Service trained in silence, their routines etched into the very soil like boot prints in wet earth. Corporal Elena Hargrove moved through it all with the quiet efficiency of someone who had long learned to blend into the background. At 32, she was one of the few women in the Intelligence Corps detachment attached to the base, her role confined to the shadowed corners of analysis and support, reviewing satellite imagery, cross-referencing signals intelligence, anything that kept her out of the spotlight. She wore the standard issue, olive drab trousers tucked into polished boots, a beret pulled low over her cropped dark hair, and a camouflage jacket that hung loosely on her slight frame. No one paid her much mind. She was the sort who fetched the maps, not the one who held the rifle. The morning briefing was in the operations block, a squat concrete building that smelled of damp wool and strong tea. Elena arrived early, as always, slipping into the back row of folding chairs, the room filled with the low hum of conversation, lance corporals joking about the weather, sergeants checking their watches. Major Thomas Hale, the detachment commander, entered with his usual clipped stride, his face set in the stern lines of a man who had seen too many exercises go sideways. He was a veteran of the regiment, his chest adorned with ribbons that spoke of tours in shadowed places, though he never boasted. "Right, Settle," he said, his voice carrying the flat Midlands accent that brooked no interruption. "Today's the live fire assessment on the range. Brecon's calling for a full patrol simulation. No slacking. Regiment eyes will be on us." The mention of Brecon beacons drew a few nods. It was the crucible for SAS selection, those brutal hills where men were forged or broken under the weight of rucksacks and relentless rain. Elena's fingers tightened on her notepad, but her expression remained impassive. She had been there once, years ago, not as a candidate, but in a capacity few knew about. Her work had taken her to the edges of operations, hidden in overlooks with a spotter's scope, feeding coordinates to teams that vanished into the mist. But that was classified, buried under layers of official secrets. Here, she was just Hargrove, the quiet one, the analyst who didn't complain when the tea ran out. As the major outlined the drill, patrol formations, casualty evacuations, the standard protocols, Elena jotted notes, her pen moving in precise strokes. The room's atmosphere thickened with the scent of wet greatcoats and machine oil from the rifles being checked in the corner. Outside, the rain pattered against the windows like impatient fingers. A private at the front shifted uncomfortably, his boots scraping the linoleum, drawing a sharp glance from a sergeant. Discipline held, but there was always that undercurrent, the rigid hierarchy that demanded conformity above all. After the briefing, the detachment spilled out into the yard, forming up for the march to the transport lorries. Elena fell in at the rear, her rucksack slung over one shoulder, containing nothing more than her laptop and a few encrypted drives. The parade square stretched before them, its surface pitted from years of boots striking in unison. The sergeant major's voice cut through the drizzle. "Fall in, by the right, quick march." Boots thudded in rhythm, a cadence as old as the army itself, echoing off the barracks walls. Elena matched the pace without flourish, her breath steady, eyes fixed on the man ahead. But as they neared the lorries, a ripple passed through the ranks. Lance Corporal Wilkins, a stocky man with a perpetual smirk, turned his head just enough to mutter to the private beside him. "Look at Hargrove back there. Air trailing like she's carrying the world's secrets in that bag. Bet she couldn't hit a barn door in Brecon." The words were low, meant for his mate, but they carried on the wet air. A few chuckles followed, muffled by the rain. Eleanor heard them, of course, Her ears were trained for subtler sounds than that, but she didn't flinch. Her posture remained straight, jaw set, gaze forward. It wasn't the first time. The mockery came in waves, subtle barbs about her place in a world of hardened lads. She was competent, yes, but not one of them. Not yet. The lorries rumbled to life, engines coughing in the cold, and the detachment climbed aboard. Elena took a seat by the canvas flap, watching as the base receded through the mist. The red brick officers' mess, the distant hum of the helicopter pads. Major Hale sat up front, reviewing a map, oblivious to the undercurrents. As the convoy lurched forward toward the beacons, the tension in Eleanor's chest tightened, a quiet coil she had carried for years. Brecon wasn't just training ground, it was memory, etched in the scar on her wrist from a night she couldn't speak of. The hills ahead loomed like silent judges, and somewhere in their folds the past waited to surface. The journey wound through narrow lanes, hedgerows dripping with rain, the Welsh border blurring into green haze. Inside the lorry, conversation turned to the exercise. Simulated ambushes, night stalks, the relentless push that separated the capable from the rest. Wilkins glanced back once, his smirk fading under the sergeant's glare, but the damage lingered. Elena stared out at the passing landscape, her mind drifting to that long-ago patrol, the one where an SAS team had been pinned down, voices crackling over the radio in desperation. "We're done for," one had said, the words haunting her still. She had been there, unseen, her shot the first to break the encirclement. But that was the regiment's secret, not hers to claim. By midday, the convoy crested the rise into Brecon's embrace, the air sharpening with the scent of peat and pine. They disembarked at the staging area, a muddy clearing ringed by gorse and stone walls. Tents were pitched with mechanical precision, rifles unpacked, the detachment falling into the grind of preparation. Eleanor assisted with the comms setup, her hands steady as she calibrated the frequencies, ignoring the sidelong looks. The rain eased to a fine mist, cloaking the hills in secrecy. As the first patrols formed up, she felt the weight of observation, not just from her comrades but from something deeper, a gaze from the shadows of her own history. Little did they know, the routine was about to fracture. The mist clung to the Brecon beacons like a shroud, muting the sharp edges of the tors and turning the heather into a sodden blur. The staging area buzzed with the controlled chaos of a live-fire assessment, soldiers unpacking gear from the lorries, the metallic clink of magazines being loaded, the low rumble of generators firing up for the comms tent. Major Hale stood at the center of it all, his voice steady as he directed the sections. "Alpha Patrol, take the eastern ridge for initial recon. Bravo, hold the fallback positions. No deviations, regiment protocols apply." His words carried the weight of expectation, the kind that bound men and women to their roles without question. Eleanor Hargrove moved through the setup with the unobtrusive grace of someone accustomed to the margins. She had volunteered for the signals detail, stringing antennae between the tents and calibrating the radios against the interference of the hills. Her hands, calloused from years of fieldwork, worked methodically, twisting coaxial cables and testing frequencies with a quiet precision that drew no attention. Private Ellis, a lanky recruit from the Midlands, handed her the toolkit without a word, his eyes flicking away as if her presence required no acknowledgement. She was Hargrove, after all, the analyst who shadowed the action, not the one who led it. Her beret sat low, shadowing her eyes, and her jacket bore the faint patina of rain-slicked wool. The detachment fell into the rhythm of the exercise, with the discipline ingrained from Credenhill's parade square. Lance Corporal Wilkins, still nursing his morning smirk, organized the ammo crates, barking orders to the privates under his charge. "Stack 'em proper, lads. No spillages on my watch." His voice held the rough edge of a man who thrived on the chain of command. His sergeant's stripes a badge of authority, he wielded like a subtle weapon. Sergeant Patel, a wiry veteran with a neatly trimmed beard, oversaw the rifle checks, his inspections thorough and unforgiving. "Bolt carrier clean? Sights zeroed?" "Right. Pass it through." The air smelled of gun oil and damp earth, the kind of scent that permeated every British training ground, from Aldershot's windswept plains to the relentless Welsh uplands. Elena finished the comms array and stepped back, wiping her hands on a rag. The first patrol, Alpha Section, led by Wilkins, formed up at the edge of the clearing, their Bergens heavy with simulated loads. Major Hale gave the nod, and they moved out in a staggered column, boots sinking into the peat with measured steps. Elena monitored the initial transmissions from the command tent, her earpiece crackling with position reports. Alpha actual, crossing the stream at grid 0456, visibility low. She logged it all, her pencil scratching softly on the pad, cross-referencing with the topographic maps spread across the trestle table. No one consulted her directly. She was the support, the invisible thread holding the weave together. As the afternoon wore on, the mist thickened into a proper drizzle, drumming against the canvas roofs. The fallback positions took shape on a lower slope, Bravo Section digging shallow scrapes under Patel's watchful eye. Eleanor assisted with the placement of the repeater units, hauling the lightweight packs up the incline without complaint. Her breath came even, controlled, betraying none of the ache in her shoulders from the weight. Halfway up, Wilkins paused his own section to light a cigarette, the flame flickering briefly in the gloom. He caught sight of her navigating the rocks and nudged Ellis. "Oi, look at the ghost up there. Hargrove playing at being a mule. Reckon she thinks this is some desk job holiday?" Ellis snorted, low and dismissive, but kept his eyes on his task. The words drifted up on the wind, sharp as shrapnel, but Eleanor didn't turn. Her posture held firm, shoulders square, steps deliberate. She had heard worse in the mess halls of Hereford, the casual barbs that marked her as an outsider in a lineage of bayonets and battle honours. In the command tent, Major Hale reviewed the overlays, his brow furrowed under the dim glow of the lantern. Patrols on schedule. Keep the channels clear. Elena relayed the confirmation, her voice even over the radio. Command signals nominal, no interference. He glanced at her briefly, a nod of acknowledgement that was as much as she ever received. Competence was her currency, paid in silence. Around them, the base routines pulsed on, the clatter of mess tins as rations were distributed. The sergeant major's clipped call for a head count. "All present, sound off." Voices responded in order from private to lance corporal, the hierarchy etched in every syllable. By late afternoon, the exercise shifted into its core phase, a simulated encirclement on the ridgeline. Alpha Patrol advanced into the fold of the hills, their figures vanishing into the heather like ghosts. Eleanor took her position at the observation post, a concealed nook overlooking the valley, her binoculars trained on the terrain. The wind carried the faint echo of blank rounds popping in the distance, the patrols weaving through gullies scarred by decades of training. She spotted Wilkins' section first, their formation tight but predictable, the lance corporal gesturing sharply to his men. A flaw in the line caught her eye, a private lagging, Bergen strap loose. But she noted it without comment, her role observation only. The drizzle persisted, soaking through her collar, but Elena remained still, her focus unyielding. Memories flickered at the edges of her mind, a similar ridge, years prior, under the cover of night. The SAS patrol then had been real, not simulated, no blanks, no safety nets. Pinned by shadows in the rocks, their radio had hissed with urgency. Positions compromised, no exfil. She had been the unseen asset, perched in an overlook much like this, her rifle steady against the cold stone. The shot that broke the silence, the one that shifted the tide, remained classified, a ghost in her file. The scar on her wrist itched faintly now, a thin white line from the recoil's bite hidden beneath her cuff. Patel approached the OP briefly, checking the sightlines. "Holding steady, Corporal." His tone was professional, devoid of warmth or scorn, the standard exchange between ranks. "Affirmative, Sergeant. Clear visuals." He moved on, leaving her to the vigil. Below, the patrols tightened their maneuvers, the air filling with the sharp cracks of simulated fire. Wilkins's voice crackled over the net. "Contact front, taking cover." The exercise built toward its peak, the beacons indifferent witnesses to the drill. As dusk began to grey the sky, Elena adjusted her position, the wet ground seeping through her trousers. The competence she displayed was quiet, unremarked, much like the hills themselves, enduring, unyielding. But in the ranks below, the undercurrents stirred, the mockery a subtle erosion against the facade of order. Little did they realize, the cracks were forming, waiting for the moment when silence would give way to revelation. The exercise intensified, as the sun dipped behind the beacon's jagged silhouettes, casting the valley in a pallid twilight that blurred the line between hill and sky. The air grew heavier, with the scent of wet peat and cordite from the blank rounds, the patrols weaving through the gullies like threads in a fraying tapestry. Elena Hargrove maintained her vigil at the observation post, her binoculars sweeping the terrain with methodical sweeps. The wind tugged at her collar, carrying the faint echo of commands from below. Flank left. Cover the draw. Wilkins' Alpha section pressed forward, their silhouettes stark against the heather, while Bravo held the rear with Patel's unyielding oversight. From her perch, Elena logged the movements, her notepad filling with grid references and timestamps. The scar on her wrist burned faintly under the damp cuff of her jacket, a reminder of the night that had forged her in silence. She pushed it aside, focusing on the patrol's formation. A slight hesitation in Ellis's step, a gap in the line that could spell vulnerability in a real op. But she relayed nothing unbidden. Her role was to observe, not intervene. Below, the detachment moved with the precision drilled into them at Credenhill, boots sinking into the mud with rhythmic thuds, rifles held at low ready. As the simulated encirclement peaked, Major Hale called a halt for the evening stand-down. Regroup at the staging area, debrief in 10. The patrols extracted, faces streaked with sweat and grime, converging on the clearing where tents glowed faintly under portable lanterns. Elena descended the slope carefully, her boots sliding on loose scree, arriving just as the sections formed up for the after-action review. The air hummed with the low chatter of debriefs, sergeants critiquing positions, privates stowing gear with weary efficiency. Rations were distributed from the cook tent, foil packs of stew and hard biscuits, the steam rising like ghosts in the chill. Eleanor queued at the rear, her tray balanced in one hand, the weight of the day settling into her bones. The line shuffled forward, the clatter of mess tins a familiar underscore to military life. Wilkins, wiping mud from his face, stood ahead with Ellis, their voices carrying over the murmur. Bloody Hargrove up on that hill all day, scribbling away like it's a tea party. Bet she didn't spot a thing through that mist. Ellis chuckled, a low rumble. Reckon she's just here to make up the numbers. Intelligence Corps, more like intelligence optional. The barbs were casual, the kind that passed for camaraderie in the ranks, but they landed with the precision of aimed fire. She reached the serving table, ladling stew onto her tray with steady hands, her expression unchanging. As she turned to find a seat, the crowd shifted. A private jostled past, his elbow catching her arm. The tray tilted, the tin of stew sliding toward the edge. Time slowed. She adjusted instinctively, but Wilkins, turning from his spot, extended a hand as if to steady her. Only his grip closed around her wrist instead, firm and unyielding, pulling her tray down in a deliberate arc. The mess spilled across the muddy ground, stew splattering her boots and the hem of his trousers. Gasps rippled through the nearby group, a few privates freezing mid-bite. "Oi! Watch it, Hargrove," Wilkins said, his voice pitched just loud enough for the section to hear, releasing her wrist with a flick that left red marks blooming on her skin. "Clumsy as a civvy on her first march. Clean that up. Don't want the Major thinking we're running a nursery." Laughter erupted from Ellis and a couple of others, sharp and fleeting, cut short by Patel's approaching glare. But the damage echoed in the clearing, heads turning, eyes assessing. Eleanor stood motionless, the empty tray dangling from her fingers, her gaze fixed on the ground where the food mingled with the earth. No retort rose to her lips. She knelt instead, retrieving the tin with deliberate calm, her posture rigid, betraying nothing of the heat rising in her chest. Major Hale, emerging from the command tent, paused at the edge of the scene, his brow creasing faintly. "What's this?" His tone was even, expectant. Wilkins straightened, wiping his hand on his trousers. "Just a spill, sir. Hargrove's tray. Slipped right out." The Major's eyes flicked to Eleanor, still kneeling, then back to Wilkins. "See to it, Corporal, and you back to your post. No further inquiry. The hierarchy absorbed the moment like mist into stone. Eleanor rose, tray in hand, and moved to the serving line again, queuing silently as if the incident had been a mere ripple in the routine. In the mess tent, under the canvas sagging with rain, she sat alone at the end of a bench, picking at the fresh ration with a plastic spoon. The laughter had subsided, replaced by the scrape of chairs and the murmur of after-action talk. Patel slid onto the bench opposite, his tray clattering down. "Rough go up there today?" His question was neutral, a sergeant's check on his subordinate. Elena met his eyes briefly, her own steady. "Clear visuals, Sergeant. Logged all contacts." He nodded, forking into his stew without pressing further. Around them, the detachment unwound, boots kicked off under tables, cigarettes lit in the dim light filtering through the flaps. The smell of boiled meat and damp wool filled the space, a comfort in its familiarity. But the mockery lingered like the chill seeping through the canvas. As Elena finished her meal, Ellis passed by, tray in hand, muttering under his breath to a mate. Spilling like that, embarrassing for the whole section. She heard it, of course, her senses honed sharper than they knew. Her wrist throbbed faintly where Wilkins had gripped it, the skin tender beneath the cuff, echoing the scar hidden alongside. She stacked her tray with quiet efficiency, stepping out into the night where the beacons loomed as dark sentinels. The stars struggled through the cloud cover, pinpricks of light over the endless folds of hill. Eleanor walked the perimeter of the camp, her boots crunching on gravel, the wind whispering through the gorse. Competence had always been her shield, silence her armor, but tonight it felt thinner, tested by the casual cruelty of the ranks. Brecon's shadows held their own judgments, memories of that encircled patrol surfacing unbidden, the desperate radio call, her finger on the trigger, the shot that had silenced the threat before it consumed them. "We're done for," the voice had crackled, but she had made it otherwise. Classified, unspoken, a burden she carried alone. Back at her tent, she unrolled her sleeping bag, the canvas walls fluttering softly. The camp settled into quiet, the occasional cough or murmur punctuating the night. Elena lay awake, staring at the ridgeline silhouetted against the sky, her mind tracing the paths of tomorrow's drills. The injustice burned internally, a controlled flame, expressed not in words, but in the set of her jaw, the stillness of her form. Discipline demanded restraint, and she gave it fully, waiting for the exercise to unfold its truths. Little did the detachment know, the test was only beginning, the cracks in the order widening with each passing hour. Comment where you're watching from. I want to know how far stories of courage and integrity can reach. The first light of dawn crept over the beacons like a reluctant intruder, painting the ridges in muted greys and silvers. The camp stirred under a fresh veil of mist, the air crisp with the tang of dew-soaked heather and the faint, acrid residue of last night's fires. Elena Hargrove rose before the bugle, her sleeping bag rolled with military neatness, her movements silent as she laced her boots by the dim glow of a headlamp. The events of the previous evening lingered in the ache of her wrist, but she pushed it down, folding it into the disciplined core that had sustained her through shadowed assignments. Brecon's unforgiving terrain demanded focus, not reflection. The exercise resumed at 600, with patrols pushing deeper into the folds of the hills. She reported to the command tent as the sections formed up, her notepad tucked under her arm, ready for the morning signals brief. Major Hale was already there, poring over the overnight logs with Sergeant Patel, their voices low and measured against the canvas walls. "Eastern sectors clear for advance. Keep the overwatch tight. Visibility's playing tricks again." Elena relayed the frequencies, her tone clipped and professional, earning a brief nod from the major. No mention of the spill. Such incidents dissolved into the routine, absorbed by the chain of command like water into parched earth. Outside, the detachment mustered in the clearing, rifles slung, Bergens adjusted with the familiar creak of straps. Wilkins barked at the privates, his voice carrying the edge of authority. "Kit check, now. No excuses on my ground." The patrols moved out in sequence, Alpha section leading into a narrow defile where the mist hung thickest, Bravo shadowing from the high ground. Eleanor took her assigned post at a secondary observation point, a rocky outcrop overlooking the valley's eastern flank. The ascent was steep, her boots gripping the slick scree with practiced care, the wind whipping at her jacket as she settled into position. Binoculars in hand, she scanned the terrain, the patrol's staggered line weaving through boulders, Ellis correcting his footing after a slip, Wilkins gesturing sharply to maintain cover. She logged it all, the wind speed affecting trajectories, the intermittent crackle of radio static, her pencil moving in steady arcs. Competence was her silent testament, unobserved and unremarked. Mid-morning brought an unexpected ripple to the exercise. A low hum echoed from the west, growing into the thrum of rotors slicing the air. Elena lowered her binoculars, spotting the dark silhouette of a Chinook cresting the ridge, its blades churning the mist into eddies. It touched down lightly in the staging area below, disgorging a small group, no more than a dozen figures in subdued camouflage, their gear stripped to essentials, faces shadowed under low-pulled caps. SAS, they moved with the economy of men who wasted nothing, not energy, not words. No fanfare marked their arrival. The detachment paused briefly, eyes flicking toward the newcomers before resuming tasks. Major Hale approached the lead figure, a tall man with the bearing of quiet command, his beret bearing the winged dagger insignia. "Captain Reynolds, sir, welcome to the assessment." The captain nodded once, his gaze sweeping the camp with unhurried assessment. "Carrying on, Major. We're here for the Joint Phase Overwatch integration." His voice was even, Midlands flat, carrying no inflection beyond necessity. The SAS unit dispersed without ceremony, some to the firing points, others to the command perimeter, their presence a subtle shift in the air, like the tightening of a bolt in a well-oiled mechanism. Eleanor watched from her vantage, noting the way they moved. Fluid, observant, boots placing weight with predatory care. Whispers passed through Bravo section as Patel relayed the update. "Regiment's eyes on us now. Step lively." As the patrols pressed forward, the integration began seamlessly. 2 SAS troopers joined Alpha's flank, their silhouettes blending into the heather without disrupting the line. From her post, Elena tracked them. One paused at a stream crossing, kneeling to check the flow, his eyes lifting not to the water, but to the ridgeline opposite. Her ridgeline. She held still, adjusting her position fractionally behind a boulder, but his gaze lingered a beat longer than protocol demanded. It was subtle, a flicker of recognition in the set of his shoulders, but gone as he rose and continued. Coincidence, she told herself. The hills played tricks on the mind. The exercise built tempo through noon, the mist burning off to reveal patches of blue sky over the tors. Simulated contacts flared in the gullies, blank rounds popping like distant thunder, sections calling maneuvers over the net. Elena's radio crackled with traffic. "Contact right, suppressing." She relayed coordinates to command, her voice steady amid the chatter. Below, in the staging area, Captain Reynolds conferred with Hale, their discussion masked by the wind, but Elena caught fragments through her earpiece. References to legacy protocols, words that stirred the edges of her classified past. The SAS presence amplified the scrutiny. Wilkins, sensing it, drove his section harder, his commands sharper. "Close it up, eyes front." During a brief halt for repositioning, one of the SAS troopers, a sergeant by his insignia, broad-shouldered with a faint scar tracing his jaw, detached from the group and ascended toward the observation points. He moved with the quiet assurance of the regiment, skirting the scree without dislodging a stone. Elena tensed as he neared her outcrop, but he stopped short, 10 meters downslope, scanning the valley with his own binoculars. She resumed her vigil, but awareness prickled, the way his posture shifted when he glanced her way, not overt, but a stillness that spoke volumes. Her cuff rode up slightly as she adjusted her scope, exposing the thin white scar on her wrist, the mark from that long-ago night in these very hills. He didn't stare, didn't approach. Instead, he lowered his glasses, his eyes meeting hers for a fraction of a second. Direct, appraising, then away. No words, no gesture, just the subtle acknowledgement of shared shadows. Back at the base, the integration deepened. The SAS unit observed the debriefs with impassive attention, Captain Reynolds standing at the trestle table, arms folded, as Hale outlined the morning's flaws. Gap in the flank. Addressed. The captain nodded, his silence heavier than critique. Elena descended for the midday ration, queuing amid the detachment, her tray steady this time. Wilkins avoided her gaze, his earlier bravado tempered by the newcomer's presence. As she ate, the sergeant from earlier passed nearby, collecting spent casings, his path bringing him within earshot. He didn't speak, but his eyes flicked to her wrist again, now concealed, and he paused, boots planted firm in the mud before moving on. It was the quiet professionalism of the regiment, observation without intrusion, respect earned in glances, not declarations. Afternoon patrols resumed under the joint oversight, the SAS weaving into the formations like threads reinforcing a seam. Eleanor monitored from a new vantage, the wind carrying the scent of pine and gun oil. The captain himself took a forward position, his radio silent save for essential calls. She caught his silhouette against the sky, unmoving as stone, watching the sections below. In that moment the air felt charged, the beacons holding their breath. Hints of her past surfaced in the periphery, a call sign half remembered in a static burst, the scars itch under scrutiny. The observers had arrived, their stillness a mirror to her own, drawing lines between the present drill and the classified echoes of Brecon's unforgiving embrace. As the sun slanted low, casting long shadows over the peat, the exercise hummed on, the detachment unaware of the subtle currents shifting beneath. Elena's competence, once invisible, now drew unseen eyes. Details noticed, backgrounds glimpsed. The hierarchy held, rigid as ever, but cracks formed in the mist, waiting for the light to pierce through. The evening debrief gathered the detachment under the sagging canvas of the main tent, the air thick with the mingled scents of damp wool, reheated rations, and the faint metallic tang of spent blanks. Lanterns cast a steady amber glow across the trestle tables, illuminating maps pinned with red flags and the faces of soldiers etched with the day's fatigue. Major Hale stood at the head, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, outlining the joint phase's objectives for the morrow. Integrated overwatch on the western ridge, with SAS elements leading the simulated breach. "Precision matters," he said, his voice carrying the clipped authority of Credenhill's parade square. "No room for lapses, eyes on the flanks at all times." The sections sat in ordered rows, privates at the back, lance corporals midway, the hierarchy as unyielding as the beacon's stone. Elena Hargrove took her place at the edge of the Intelligence Corps contingent, her notepad open on her knee, pencil poised. The SAS unit occupied a shadowed corner, their postures relaxed yet alert. Captain Reynolds at the fore with arms folded, his expression a mask of quiet appraisal. The sergeant from the ridge earlier sat beside him, his jaw set, eyes scanning the room without haste. Whispers had circulated through the afternoon patrols, muted speculation about the regiment's scrutiny, the way their presence sharpened every maneuver. Wilkins shifted in his seat, his earlier smirk subdued under the weight of observation, while Ellis kept his gaze on the floor, fingers drumming a silent rhythm on his knee. Hale continued, gesturing to the overlay. "Overwatch positions here and here, signals to maintain clear lines." His eyes swept the group, lingering briefly on Elena as she jotted the coordinates. She met it with a steady nod, her wrist tucked beneath the table's edge, the scar concealed once more. The debrief flowed methodically, Sergeant Patel recapping Alpha's advance, noting the gap Elena had observed but not voiced. "Flank tightened post-contact, effective adjustment." Nods rippled through the ranks, the routine affirmation of discipline over error. Outside, the wind sighed through the gorse, carrying the chill of descending night, the beacon's silhouettes black against a star-pricked sky. As Hale wrapped the session, Captain Reynolds rose without preamble, his movement drawing every eye like a blade unsheathed. The tent fell into a deeper hush, the scrape of chairs ceasing, breaths held in the lantern light. He stepped to the map table, his boots leaving faint imprints on the packed earth floor, and addressed Hale directly. "Major, a word on the Overwatch integration." His tone was even, devoid of emphasis, the Midland's inflection flat as polished stone. Hale inclined his head. "Of course, Captain." But Reynolds's gaze shifted, not to the Major, but to the back row, to Elena, still and composed amid the analysts. The captain's eyes held hers for a measured beat. Then he spoke, his words carrying to the assembled ranks. In 14, during the Brecon exercise that went live, classified overlay on a patrol pinned in the eastern defile. A murmur stirred, faint as mist, but the tent held its breath. No one spoke of such things openly. The regiment's shadows rarely crossed into standard briefings. Reynolds continued, his voice unchanged, gesturing to the map's ridgeline. Team Bravo, 4 operators, encircled by simulated hostiles turning real in the fog. Radio call. We're done for. Overwatch asset fired the breach shot. Coordinates fed blind from 800 meters. Saved the lot of us. He paused, his posture unchanging. But the air thickened, the detachment leaning forward imperceptibly. Wilkins straightened, confusion creasing his brow, while Patel's eyes narrowed in recognition. Elena remained motionless, her pencil suspended, the internal coil in her chest tightening. Not with fear, but with the quiet inevitability of exposure. Reynolds turned fully now, facing her directly, his gaze steady, appraising. That asset was here in these hills under intelligence corps cover, scar from the bipod recoil. Left wrist, thin white line, known only to those who were there. He extended no hand, offered no flourish. Instead, he brought his heels together with a soft click, standing at attention, his beret casting a shadow across his face. The salute was implicit in the stillness, the rigid line of his form a testament more profound than words. The tent froze. Major Hale's face paled slightly, his mouth opening as fragments aligned, the classified file he'd glimpsed years prior, the unexplained commendation in her records. Wilkins's smirk evaporated, his hands clenching on the table's edge, eyes darting to Eleanor's cuff as if willing it to rise. Ellis shifted, color draining from his cheeks, the earlier barbs echoing hollowly in the silence. Sergeant Patel rose halfway, then settled, his nod subtle, respectful. The SAS sergeant beside Reynolds mirrored the captain's stance, his scarred jaw lifting fractionally, eyes meeting Elena's with the shared weight of unspoken bonds. No outburst followed. British restraint held the moment like a vice. Shame spread through the ranks, not in shouts, but in lowered gazes, the subtle slump of shoulders under the berets. Whispers died unborn, replaced by the creak of wood as privates straightened, their mockery transmuted into awe. Elena held the captain's gaze, her own unblinking, the reserved fire in her chest manifesting only in the faint tightening of her jaw. She rose slowly, posture impeccable, acknowledging the revelation with a nod as precise as a rifle's bolt. The scar itched beneath her cuff, a mark now illuminated, connecting her silent competence to the ghosts of that encircled patrol. Captain Reynolds broke the attention first, turning back to Hale with a single word: carry on. But the debrief dissolved into murmurs, the hierarchy bending under the weight of truth. As the sections filed out into the night, boots crunching gravel in subdued rhythm, glances followed Elena, not derisive but measuring, the quiet legend taking form in the shadows. The beacons loomed indifferent, their mist curling like veils lifted, the public reckoning etching itself into the detachment's memory. From the periphery, the SAS unit dispersed, their stillness lingering as endorsement, the past's hidden threads weaving into the present's rigid order. Major Hale approached Elena at the tent flap, his voice low. "Corporal, I had no idea." She met his eyes evenly. "Classified, sir. Until now." He nodded, a rare flicker of respect softening his features, then stepped aside. Outside, the rain resumed in a fine patter, washing the clearing clean. Wilkins passed at a distance, his head dipped. No words exchanged. The transformation was internal, expressed in silences and averted eyes, the injustice of the spill yielding to institutional acknowledgement. Elena walked the perimeter alone, the wind at her back, her steps measured, the burden lighter for its unveiling. In the command tent's dim afterglow, the maps lay untouched, the revelation hanging like fog over the camp. Brecon's hills, witnesses to so many tests, held this one closest. The quiet sniper who had fired first, her shot not just breaking encirclement, but reshaping the ranks below. The night deepened, the detachment settling into watchful repose, respect rising like dawn through the mist. The morning after the revelation dawned clear over the beacons, the mist retreating to threadbare wisps around the tors, as if the hills themselves had exhaled the night's secrets. The camp awoke to the familiar cadence of reveille, the bugle's notes piercing the crisp air with mechanical precision, but an undercurrent of stillness laced the routines. Elena Hargrove emerged from her tent, her movements as unhurried as ever, lacing her boots with the same deliberate care she had shown through years of shadowed vigils. The scar on her wrist caught the pale light as she adjusted her cuff, no longer a private mark, but a silent emblem, now shared among those who knew. She felt the weight of eyes, not mocking but appraising, as she crossed the gravel to the command tent, her posture straight, betraying none of the internal shift that had settled overnight. Major Hale was already at the trestle table, maps refolded with exacting folds, his face bearing the faint lines of a man reconciling fragments of knowledge. He looked up as she entered, his nod deeper than protocol demanded, a subtle incline that carried the regiment's echoed respect. Corporal Hargrove, signals brief at 0700. Your input on the ridge lines. No elaboration on the previous evening. British discipline absorbed such moments into the fabric of duty, unspoken yet indelible. Elena returned the nod, taking her place at the edge of the table, her notepad open. Sergeant Patel arrived moments later, his step measured, and for the first time, he pulled a chair beside hers rather than across the tent. "Morning, Corporal," he said, his voice even, the wiry frame of his body settling with a quiet solidarity. She acknowledged it with a glance, her eyes meeting his briefly. Reserved, internal, the exchange speaking volumes in its brevity. Outside, the detachment mustered in the clearing, the parade square of packed earth gleaming under the strengthening sun. Boots struck the ground in unison, the thud echoing off the stone walls of the distant barracks, but the rhythm held a new precision, as if the ranks had realigned overnight. Lance Corporal Wilkins formed up Alpha Section with his usual barked commands, yet his voice lacked its former edge, the words clipped without the undercurrent of swagger. "Fall in, kit inspection." Private Ellis stood taller in the line, his lanky form rigid, eyes fixed forward rather than darting with sidelong jests. No mutters passed between them. The air, scented with the sharp tang of dew on gorse and the faint smoke of breakfast fires, carried only the essentials of order. The SAS unit, their Chinook still grounded at the perimeter, observed from the flanks, Captain Reynolds at the fore, his winged dagger beret a stark silhouette against the rising light. As the sections prepared for the morning's patrols, the integration resumed with seamless adjustment. Elena took her position at the primary overwatch, ascending the eastern slope with the signals pack slung low, her steps sure on the slick peat. The wind whispered through the heather, carrying the low hum of generators and the metallic click of rifles being shouldered below. From her vantage, she watched the patrols deploy. Alpha weaving into the defile, Bravo shadowing the high ground, the SAS troopers embedded like reinforcements in a well-drilled seam. Captain Reynolds himself joined the forward element, his presence a steady anchor, but his eyes lifted periodically to her ridge, not insistent but aware, the stillness of his form, a continued salute to the asset who had once broken their encirclement. Mid-morning brought the first simulated contact, blanks cracking through the gullies like muffled thunder, the sections calling maneuvers over the net with heightened clarity. Elena relayed coordinates without pause, her voice steady in the earpiece. Overwatch actual, target at grid 0527, elevation confirmed. Major Hale acknowledged from command, his tone laced with a new deference. "Copy that, Corporal. Adjust fire as needed." No one questioned her input. The revelation had woven her competence into the hierarchy's core, elevating the quiet analyst to a figure of unspoken authority. Below, Wilkins paused his section at a stream crossing, his hand raised for halt, but when he glanced up slope, toward her position, his gesture shifted, a subtle wave of confirmation rather than command. Ellis, correcting a private's footing, followed the look, his earlier dismissals transmuted into focused attention. The exercise unfolded through noon, the sun warming the rocks enough to dry the lingering damp. the air filling with the earthy scent of disturbed soil and pine resin. During a repositioning halt, Sergeant Patel climbed to her post, his Bergen light on his shoulders, carrying a spare ration pack without fanfare. "Brought this up. Long watch ahead." He set it down beside her, his eyes flicking to her wrist before meeting hers directly, the nod he gave carrying the weight of shared understanding. "That shot in 14. Clean work. Regiment doesn't forget." No elaboration. His words hung brief in the wind. Then he descended, leaving her to the vigil. Elena unwrapped the pack methodically, the simple act a bridge across the ranks, her internal reserve easing fractionally under the gesture's quiet dignity. In the staging area, the debriefs took on a transformed tone. Captain Reynolds addressed the assembled sections under the canvas awning, his stance at attention as he outlined the joint protocols. Overwatch integration, key to any breach. Assets like the one on that ridge in 14 turned the tide. Echo 1, he added, the old call sign slipping into the briefing like a classified echo, directed at Elena's distant silhouette. The detachment froze mid-motion. Trays paused, boots planted, the name resonating through the hierarchy like a ripple across still water. Wilkins' face tightened, shame etching lines around his eyes, the memory of the spilled tray and gripped wrist surfacing unbidden. He stood straighter, his lance corporal stripes suddenly heavier, averting his gaze as respect supplanted the barbs. Hale saluted subtly from the table's edge, his heels clicking soft on the earth, the institutional acknowledgement spreading through the ranks like dawnlight. Ellis, queuing for water, straightened his posture, the private's slouch replaced by deliberate alignment, whispers of the evening's truth circulating in hushed tones among the privates. No mockery echoed. Instead, murmurs shifted to fragments of awe. Heard she fired blind through the fog, the legend forming in silences and sidelong nods. The SAS sergeant, collecting gear nearby, paused to mirror Reynolds' attention, his scarred jaw lifting in quiet endorsement, the group's stillness amplifying the reform. Elena, from her perch, felt the change in the air below, the rigid order bending, not breaking, to honor the hidden past that had saved lives in these very hills. As afternoon patrols extracted, the sun slanting gold over the valleys, Eleanor descended to the clearing, her boots crunching gravel with unhurried steps. The detachment deferred to her path, sections parting fractionally, eyes meeting hers with reserved respect, posture straight, silences pregnant with acknowledgement. Major Hale approached as she reached the command tent, his voice low. "Corporal, your file, it aligns now. The regiment's commendation, unofficial, but noted." She nodded, her expression composed, the moral courage that had defined her vigil now reflected in the base's transformed discipline. Wilkins passed at a distance, offering a crisp salute, unbidden, his earlier grip on her wrist, a ghost dispelled by the gesture. The camp settled into evening routines, the smell of stew rising from the cook tent, lanterns flickering to life against the encroaching dusk. No one spoke of the shift overtly. British restraint held it internal, expressed in the set of shoulders, the averted jests, the quiet competence now shared across the ranks. Elena took her meal at the central bench, Patel sliding in opposite once more, the space around her filled not with isolation, but subtle inclusion. The beacons watched impassive, their folds cradling the legacy of that first shot, the one that had encircled not just a patrol, but the bonds of honor within the regiment. From that day forward, the mockery ceased, whispers turning to echoes of respect. Elena Hargrove emerging as the quiet legend of Brecon's unforgiving embrace. The hierarchy endured, rigid yet refined, a testament to silent honor amid the disciplined pulse of military life. If this story already has your respect, hit the like button. It helps the story of Elena Hargrove reach those who still believe in honor. The days following the revelation blurred into a seamless extension of Brecon's relentless rhythm, the beacon's ridges standing sentinel over a camp, transformed not by upheaval, but by the subtle realignment of gazes and postures. Elena Hargrove moved through the routines with the same unassuming precision she had always employed, her boots tracing familiar paths across the dew-slicked peat at dawn, her hands calibrating the signals array under the grey Welsh sky. Yet the air carried a new weight, an unspoken deference that permeated the detachment, like the faint scent of gun oil lingering after a clean. No grand announcements marked the shift. It unfolded in the quiet details, the way Private Ellis now handed her the toolkit without averted eyes, his lanky frame straightening as he murmured, "Corporal, frequencies holding steady." Or how Lance Corporal Wilkins, during the morning muster, positioned his section to shield her from the wind's bite, his earlier grip on her wrist reduced to a phantom echo, replaced by a crisp nod when their paths crossed. Major Hale's briefings took on a layered formality, the trestle table in the command tent, now including Elena at its core rather than the periphery. He reviewed the overlays with his customary Midlands clip, but his gestures included her directly. "Corporal Hargrove, your read on the eastern flank. Adjust for wind shear." She responded evenly, her voice threading through the canvas walls, the scar on her wrist no longer concealed, but acknowledged in the brief flicker of his eyes. Sergeant Patel mirrored the change, his wiry vigilance extending to her post during patrols. Ascending the slopes with spare batteries or a thermos of tea, his words sparse but weighted. "Ridge clear, Corporal. Echo 1's vantage served us well before." The old call sign slipped in like a classified shorthand, binding the present drill to that fog-shrouded night in 14, when her shot had pierced the encirclement before the desperate radio call could fade. The SAS unit lingered through the week's joint phases, their Chinook's rotors a periodic hum against the hills, Captain Reynolds overseeing the integrations with his characteristic stillness. He spoke little, but his presence amplified the reform. During a midday halt, he approached Elena at the observation point, his boots silent on the scree until he was mere meters away. No salute, no overture. He simply stood beside her, binoculars raised to the valley, his voice low against the wind. "That breach in the defile. Clean lines, just like the reel. Regiment owes you the ridge." She met his gaze briefly, the reserved fire in her chest manifesting in a fractional nod, the shared silence conveying more than volumes of debriefs. He departed without flourish, his troopers following suit, their scarred faces and subdued camouflage weaving through the detachment like reinforcements in an enduring line. Below, in the staging area, the mockery had evaporated entirely, transmuted into a hush that reshaped the hierarchy's undercurrents. Whispers no longer carried barbs. Instead, they formed in clusters around the cook tent at evening stand-down, privates exchanging fragments of the tale in lowered tones. "Heard she was perched up there, blind through the mist. First shot dropped the lead, gave Bravo their exfil." Ellis, once quick with dismissal, now recounted it to a cluster of recruits, his voice steady, eyes fixed on the lantern flames. Wilkins, stacking ammo crates with mechanical rhythm, paused when Elena passed, his stocky frame halting mid-motion. "Corporal," he said, the word clipped but sincere, extending a rag for her mud-streaked hands without meeting her eyes fully, the shame of the spilled tray internalized, expressed in the gesture's quiet amends. She accepted it with a nod, her posture unchanging. The internal dignity that had sustained her through years of shadowed support now reflected back from the ranks. The exercise culminated in a full-spectrum simulation on the Western Tor, the patrols advancing under cleared skies that revealed the beacon's vast expanse in stark relief. Elena held the primary overwatch, her scope trained on the defile where history had once pinned an SAS team, her relays guiding the sections with unerring accuracy. Blanks cracked through the gullies, maneuvers unfolding in tight formations, but the detachment moved with a cohesion sharpened by revelation, flanks held without gaps, call signs exchanged with deference. Major Hale monitored from command, his radio affirmations laced with a new precision. "Overwatch confirmed. Hold fire." As the breach resolved, Captain Reynolds signaled the all-clear from the forward line, his figure unmoving amid the heather, a final endorsement in his rigid stance. Debriefs in the fading light carried the transformation's full measure. Under the canvas, sections sat in ordered rows, but eyes turned to Elena not as an afterthought, but as the linchpin. Patel recapped the advance, crediting her vantage explicitly. "Flank integration solid, owed to the high ground asset. Nods rippled through, from privates to sergeants, the hierarchy bending to honor the hidden past that had saved lives in these very folds. Wilkins contributed without his former edge, his analysis terse and focused, the lance corporal's authority now tempered by respect. Hale closed with a measured summary, his gaze settling on her. Exercise complete. Lessons from Brecon endure. The SAS departed at dusk, the Chinook lifting off in a swirl of dust and pine scent, Reynolds' parting nod from the ramp, a silent seal on the legacy. As the detachment struck tents under the emerging stars, Elena walked the perimeter one last time, the gravel crunching softly under her boots, the air cooling to carry the whisper of gorse. No one trailed her now. Instead, the camp's pulse adjusted around her presence, the quiet legend taking root in the soil of discipline. Whispers had changed from erosion to foundation, building her into the fabric of the regiment's unspoken bonds. The scar on her wrist, once a solitary burden, now symbolized the moral courage that bridged silence and salvation, her competence no longer marginal, but integral. The convoy reformed at dawn the following day, lorries rumbling to life amid the mist-shrouded hills, the journey back to Hereford winding through lanes lined with dripping hedgerows. Inside, conversation flowed in subdued tones, tales of the exercise laced with references to Echo 1, the female sniper who had fired first when all seemed lost. Eleanor sat by the flap, watching the beacons recede, their ridges etched with the weight of memory. Major Hale, up front, glanced back once, his expression conveying the institutional respect that had solidified overnight. Wilkins, across the aisle, offered a quiet, "Solid work out there, Corporal," the words hanging brief, amends woven into duty. Back at Sterling Lines, the base absorbed the return with its customary efficiency. Gear stowed in the quartermaster's sheds, reports filed in the operations block smelling of damp wool and polished oak. The parade square gleamed under a fine rain, boots echoing in muster as the detachment fell in. The sergeant major's bark unchanged, yet the ranks aligned with a deeper precision. Elena resumed her shadowed role in the Intelligence Corps detachment, analyzing feeds from distant operations, but the undercurrents had shifted irrevocably. Colleagues nodded in passing, superiors consulted her input without qualification. The quiet professionalism of British military life, now encompassing her as an equal thread. From that day forward, no barbs pierced the routines. Respect rose in the silences between drills, the averted jests giving way to shared glances of acknowledgement. Eleanor Hargrove became the quiet legend of Credenhill's enclave, a sniper's shot in Brecon's embrace that not only broke an encirclement, but forged bonds across the rigid hierarchy. In the cold Hereford mornings, as rain pattered against the barracks windows, her story whispered through the ranks, her testament to the enduring strength of reserved honor and moral courage within the regiment's unyielding discipline. The weeks following the return from Brecon settled into the steady cadence of Sterling Lines, where the Hereford rain fell in persistent sheets, turning the gravel paths into mirrors of the overcast sky. Elena Hargrove resumed her duties in the Intelligence Corps Annex, a low-slung building tucked behind the officers' mess, its walls lined with secure terminals humming softly under fluorescent lights. Mornings began with the familiar muster on the parade square, boots striking the wet concrete in unison, the sergeant major's voice cutting through the drizzle like a well-honed blade. Eyes front, left, right, center, the detachment formed ranks with mechanical precision, berets pulled low, rifles slung at rest. But the air held a subtle refinement, as if the beacon's revelations had been absorbed into the very rhythm of drill. Elena stood in her place among the analysts, her posture impeccable, the scar on her wrist a faint line beneath her cuff no longer a secret, but a quiet marker of endurance. No one spoke of it overtly. Such matters dissolved into the fabric of military life, expressed in the averted jests and the newfound deference that threaded through interactions. Major Hale passed her in the corridor one grey afternoon, his stride clipped as he reviewed a briefing folder, pausing just long enough to incline his head. "Corporal Hargrove, your analysis on the signals overlay was spot on. Carry that forward." His words were professional, devoid of flourish, but the acknowledgement lingered, a bridge across the hierarchy that had once confined her to the shadows. Sergeant Patel, now reassigned to Joint Operations Coordination, included her in the tactical huddles with a nod rather than invitation, his wiry frame leaning over maps in the ops room, the scent of strong tea and fresh ink permeating the space. "Ridgeline echoes from Brecon. Factor in the overwatch here," he'd say, his eyes meeting hers briefly, the reference to Echo 1 implicit, binding the classified past to current protocols. She contributed without elaboration, her voice even over the low murmur of printers and radio static, cross-referencing intercepts with the precision that had once saved lives in the mist. Privates like Ellis, encountering her during equipment handovers, straightened instinctively, their lanky forms shedding the slouch of inexperience. "Ma'am, toolkit secured," one would murmur, the title slipping unbidden. A subtle elevation born of the legend, now whispered in the barracks at lights out. Lance Corporal Wilkins, whose grip on her wrist had marked the turning point, navigated the change with internal resolve. During a routine inspection in the quartermaster's shed, amid stacks of olive-drab crates and the metallic tang of oiled webbing, he approached her station, his stocky build casting a brief shadow. "Corporal Bergen, straps adjusted per spec, your check." No apology surfaced. British restraint forbade such overtures, but his tone carried the weight of amends, his eyes holding hers for a measured second before dropping to the task. She inspected the gear methodically, nodding approval, the moment passing like the rain against the window panes. Quiet, transformative, the injustice of the spilled tray transmuted into mutual respect. The SAS presence echoed indirectly through Hereford's veiled networks, classified memos circulating in redacted files that Hale referenced in closed-door sessions. Captain Reynolds, though departed to shadowed postings, had ensured the thread connected, a discreet commendation in Elena's record, unofficial yet noted in the regiment's ledgers, linking her sniper's shot to the patrol's salvation. Whispers reached her through Patel's sparse updates. Regiment eyes on the Brecon asset, legacy protocols engaged. Words that stirred no outward response, only the reserved satisfaction of duty fulfilled. In the mess hall, under the vaulted ceiling smelling of boiled cabbage and polished silverware, conversations shifted around her table. No longer isolated at the end of the bench, she sat amid the analysts and signals team, trays clattering in subdued harmony, the detachment's undercurrents flowing with inclusion rather than exclusion. Evenings brought the quiet pulse of base life, the distant thrum of the gym's weights, the clipped laughter from the Nafi bar, the parade square emptying under sodium lamps casting pools of yellow light. Elena walked the perimeter paths alone, her boots echoing softly on the damp tarmac, the cold air sharpening her breath into visible plumes. Memories of Brecon surfaced unbidden, the desperate crackle of the radio, "We're done for," the steady pressure of her finger on the trigger, the encirclement broken in silence. Yet these reflections remained internal, expressed in the set of her shoulders, the unyielding gaze toward the horizon where Credenhill's hills faded into night. The moral courage that had defined her vigil now permeated the ranks, a subtle force reshaping the rigid hierarchy without fracturing it. Public recognition came not in fanfare, but in institutional gestures, an invitation to the Selection Oversight Board, her input solicited on Overwatch tactics, the winged dagger insignia glimpsed in passing commendations. The detachment's discipline deepened, drills executed with a cohesion that honored the hidden pasts within their midst. No excess heroism marked the change. It was the British way, restraint first, honor in the quiet spaces between orders. Wilkins, leading a night stalk exercise, incorporated her simulated vantage into the briefing, his voice steady. "Asset on the ridge. Echo 1 protocols apply." The sections nodded, the legend woven into training, ensuring Brecon's lesson endured. As autumn deepened, the rain turning to frost-laced mornings, Elena's role evolved seamlessly, her competence no longer underestimated, but integral to the regiment's shadowed weave. The base at Hereford stood as it always had, boots echoing through the parade square, the smell of wet concrete at dawn, the low hum of helicopters on distant pads. But the air carried a refined clarity, the injustice of mockery yielding to the quiet dignity of recognition. From that single act in the beacons, a transformation rippled outward, testing and affirming the difference between blind orders and moral resolve. In the end, Elena Hargrove's story became a cornerstone of Credenhill's unspoken law. The female sniper who fired first, her shot not just piercing fog and threat, but illuminating the silent honor that bound the regiment. British discipline, with its reserved internal fire, proved resilient, forging legends in the restraint of everyday duty, where quiet professionalism triumphed over the cracks in order. Subscribe for more stories of loyalty, courage, and justice within the ranks. Thank you for watching the case of We're Done For. SAS patrol was surrounded in Brecon until a hidden female sniper fired first. See you in the next one.